boy, oh boy, oh boy. Coming after a visionary in my hometown. This is probably only the second time I've ever spoke publicly in my hometown. So I am nervous for a whole host of reasons. First of all, thanking Jerry Edelman and his staff for inviting me to be a part of Honoring Phil, which is just so wonderful. And you know, Jerry and his staff are very gracious and very on top of things. So every few weeks they would email me, is everything okay? Do you need anything? You know there are going to be 800 people there. So that's one reason for my nerves. When Phil introduced the SOM team, I had not noticed that there's this table of men who hired me and trained me and sat next to me telling jokes at 3 in the morning while we designed projects in London and drank scotch in Detroit. So I'm nervous for that reason, because if you're an architect, it's like standing up for your final crit before your masters. And then I'm also a little nervous because I have a handful of very close friends, one of which is my oldest friend since the age of 13, who has known me forever. So that's both comforting and nerve-wracking as well. So thank you all for being here. I am really extraordinarily honored to be here, honoring Phil in particular, because I tell him this, and we've had different paths now that I've been a city planning director in cities, and I've had the opportunity to hire SOM and Phil to work with me on a lot of the challenges that Phil talked about. And I always tell him, Phil, you know, I owe you so much. You really have been a big part of shaping the professional I am. And he goes, whatever. But it's really true. And hopefully, just by hearing the work that he takes on, that he kind of thinks up in his spare time, or if you've had the opportunity to work with him, you know he has this extraordinary ability to take these complex issues, distill them down to these big ideas in such an accessible way, in such a powerful way. And so he's taught me so much about the art of communication as an urban designer and planner. He's taught me urban design and an appreciation for the environment and sustainability. So I really, really do mean it when I thank you for your counsel, mentorship, and advice. Okay. Jerry also encouraged me, because I am a native Chicagoan from the South Side, that he thought it'd be really great for this audience to, link it to, Chicago and growing up here. And I know you've worked all over the place, but, it's Chicago. So I said, okay. And it reminded me of a comment that Phil made to me. And, we always have these things we remember about people we admire. And some of them are really oddball things. So, Phil, I'm not going to tell the story about your ears, the first winter of Chicago, coming from San Francisco. But I am going to, what sticks with me, particularly with Jerry's instruction, was this really passing comment you made to me. It was actually an evening in Detroit. We were working in the Westin on the Renaissance Center with Richard Tomlinson and Jaime Velez, and we were, I was with the boys having scotch in the lounge. And we were going back to our rooms, and Phil goes, you never talk about yourself. Which is true, and Ramona will attest to this, my best friend. I don't really talk about myself very much. So I thought this would be an opportunity, being in my hometown, honoring someone I admire, and in Jerry Edelman's instruction, that I use myself and my story as a filter to talk about cities and open lands. I'd like to talk about and focus this on the importance of cities and the work to be done to create a just city, which is actually the name of the center I've started at the City College of New York. It's the J. Max Bond Center on Design for the Just City. And it's about looking at how issues of equity, access, inclusion, and embracing cultural difference becomes more of an embedded part of our practice in creating cities and the places within them. So now, I'm also nervous because if you're an architect, you know you never not have your presentation right in front of you. It's behind me, and I can't look around. So I hope that the slides that we're going to see come up actually align with what I'm going to say, because I'm going to be reading. So you'll occasionally see me look behind me to see if things move. Okay. It would be ideal to imagine that as a child of Chicago's South Side, and now an architect and urban planner, that the works of my architectural predecessors greatly influenced my career path in some small way and subconscious way. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. My first home was on 5612 South Calumet Avenue, 600 feet from Burnham's Washington Park. Now, I have absolutely no memory of my days so close to this spatial legacy, but my mother tells me we would walk every day to the park and that I loved the crunch of the fall leaves, as I still do today. It's been fun over the last couple of days to really ponder this and sit back and wonder if these early experiences planted seeds of my interest in urban spaces and cities. Perhaps it's no coincidence that, in fact, I share a birthday with the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, July 1st. And these tend to be the issues that really do drive and motivate my professional interests. But between 1964 and 1966, to me, Washington Park was simply this field of red, orange, and green crunchy sounds. But perhaps to my mother, it was a space that was about the issues and divisions of race and class, access and opportunity, Hyde Park, and Garfield Park. Oops. Sorry, that was a preview. I spoiled the fun. At the age of 2, my parents had saved enough money to leave my grandmother's apartment on South Calumet Avenue and move to this new colonial-style townhouse development on the far south side called London Town, town with an E. Fancy. Very fancy. My friends and I were certainly unaware of the fact that this development utilized town planning principles that went into creating the siting of 800 townhomes that all had their individual front lawns, but when connected, their backyards formed these small village greens, a new term that I actually learned by working with Phil Inquist. Our backyards were the public realm where my friends and I played. It was safe and collective space for about 25 kids, all between the ages of 3 and 12. We played all day. Our mothers borrowed sugar and milk, and our dads on the weekends would barbecue and trade tips and determine who it was the best cook of the backyard. As I flip to this slide, you might be looking at a couple of things, either my Afro puffs or the fact that the green in the village green is no longer green. By the time my sister was born in 1970, most of our moms and dads were away at work from 9 to 5. The village green became more important to us, now known as the latchkey kids, who took to keeping watchful eyes on ourselves. We used this space for everything from dodgeball, red light, green light, tag, the occasional plays. We had a wedding of 2 little kids. And with my friend Mark Watson, I actually mounted a Democratic National Convention in 1972. We used this space so much that the property management finally had to prohibit us from playing ball and other such activities because they just couldn't afford to keep resodding the grass 4 to 6 times a summer. Now, while I used this village green as my playground, I was actually about 2 blocks away from Gately Park and Gately Stadium. But unless we needed to mount a real sort of all-on sort of softball game with a neighboring village green, the backyard was the place to be. It wasn't really till high school, Lindblom Technical High School, that the park and its stadium became my new social space. I really always felt lucky that it lived so close to this, especially in night games, because after the games, all my friends would come to my house to hang out. So my world of open space, and Jerry asked me about my experience in open space in Chicago, was actually very small, limited to less than a half-mile radius. It was only when we were on school trips or when we took visits to downtown to see a show or a play that I really got to experience more of the robust aspects of the plan of Chicago. Later, as I began to learn the plan of Chicago, I was also becoming more aware of how this beautiful lace of open and green spaces creates divides. Unintentional in their design, but ultimately providing physical cues for where intentional actions of divide would occur throughout the city. And Chicago is no different to have this phenomenon. Many of today's American cities remain racially and economic divided spaces. In all of these cities I have gone on to work in my career as an urban planner and designer, New York, DC, Newark, New Jersey, and Detroit, many parts of the divided city are depleted of adequate amounts of open space, and you all know this, and access is constrained. And within these spaces, what we now have is a large portfolio of the formerly urban. So while part of the mission of this amazing organization is about the conservation of natural wilds, we're coming upon this legacy of new urban wilds to contend with, where the value for market-driven development no longer exists in the same way. These spaces in shrinking, or what we now call legacy cities, can become new and innovative opportunities for expanding the green network of cities. So let me transition to my current work, as Phil mentioned, and opportunities in the city of Detroit. Probably many of you sitting here, when you've heard us say Detroit, have in your mind's eye either the world's largest urban agriculture farm in its future, or these urban wilds, images that don't necessarily speak to you of an urban context. These images are largely in place because of this reality. This is not a NOLI plan of the buildings that exist in the city. This is a plan of vacancy. There are over 150,000 vacant and abandoned parcels in the city of Detroit. 64,000 of those parcels are owned by the public sector. This represents about 20 square miles of vacant land if you were to put it all together. And if you were to overlay the cities of Manhattan, Boston, and San Francisco, which all fit within the 139 square miles of the city, the contiguous vacant land, and it's not contiguous, but if you were to aggregate it, would roughly be the size of the island of Manhattan. So it's not quite easy to think of Manhattan as the largest urban gardening farm in the city. Therefore, it really is a moment in time where we must think of new opportunities for these formerly urban spaces. And we all know the history of the legacy about how we've come to inherit this landscape through federal policies of the last century that allowed urbanization to spread throughout the region, often turning its back on our urban core communities and cities, and leaving behind disposable areas of deconstruction and sometimes decomposition. Creating two conditions, and we can have lots of interesting debates, as I'm sure you do in this region, that both of these are potentially unsustainable over the long term. So what do we do? As people have removed themselves from these urban landscapes, a natural succession is taking place and is being spontaneously adopted into city life, offering us, again, I think, an amazing opportunity to think about how urban ecologies become more a part of our urban landscape. Horticulturalist Peter Del Trecce of the Arnold Arboretum in Boston reminds us that a whole new kind of ecology is forming right before our eyes. The challenge we face is not how to eliminate these emergent ecosystems, but rather how to manipulate them into better serving our needs in the urban environment. So how can we take a system of more traditional parks and recreation spaces and this rapidly emerging landscape of successional ecologies and create a new plan for Detroit? We've begun working on this about 3 years ago. SOM was a part of our team. AECOM and Andre Brumfield was a part of our team, as well as a whole host of other practitioners, Happold Consulting, Hamilton Anderson, Stoss, Landscape Urbanism, bringing together, just as Phil said, the collective disciplines to look at the urban issues that are both economic and spatial, and trying to think of what the new urban form of the city would be, informed by its employment districts, its historic corridors and transit, its diverse collection of neighborhoods, and actually beginning to see that there really was a new opportunity for the landscape of the city to form a new identity for it. We've taken a fairly non-traditional approach, perhaps somewhat form-based, and not looking at traditional zoning codes for land use, but actually looking at different land use typologies. There are several new residential neighborhood typologies we introduce, several new mixed-use neighborhood typologies we introduce. We still believe there is a role for modern economy in Detroit. And then we've introduced a whole new vocabulary of landscape typologies to be introduced into the new zoning code. So in addition, these typologies are 5. In addition to our community-based spaces of parks, rec centers, and plazas, we want to introduce ecological landscapes, places for natural parks, innovative industrial parks, recognizing that places of rapid reforestation actually make sense in the city. The introduction of blue-green infrastructure, which I'll focus on a little bit more in a moment, but this as a part of the new network of green and open spaces in our cities and regions, and the work that Phil is doing in the Great Lakes is a testament to that. This is bringing it down to another scale. And by the way, I have to say, this has been one of the more fascinating sort of lunches I've been to. We've been at the scale of the reuse of metal for public art to the Great Lakes bi-continent region, to the scale of the city. So a real testament to the type of issues that the organization puts forward, Jerry, so thank you for that. Working and productive landscapes. We actually feel that landscape can help heal our land, clean our soil and our air. And then lastly, transitional landscapes. We do recognize that as cities evolve, the ways with which we can use vacant land, even in transitional and interim ways, to help sustain communities is important. So when we start to lay these things out spatially, we end up with not just a map of where the parks are in the city, we end up with a map of where our innovative productive landscapes are. The fact that there is a robust food network ecology that is emerging in the city that creates a green network for us to experience, and that the ways with which we can populate the landscape by utilizing blue-green infrastructure begins to create a new urban form for the city. As Phil mentioned, the work that we've been doing has not just been about land use, it's also been about economic growth. And while it would be very easy for us as architects and planners to create lovely illustrative images of what the city could look like, we recognize that that would have little value unless we understood the real performance and operational implications of what it means to change a city. And to recognize that you're dealing with a city that is not in a traditional growth mode, but it is a mode where its population is going to be smaller, and therefore the ways with which we must sustainably use land and manage resources, including city services, was of vital importance. So using landscape as 21st century infrastructure has emerged as one of the bigger ideas of our planning framework, and that we can actually do this in a way that makes our infrastructure much more multifunctional and inclusive, so that we're dealing with the issues of the fact that we right now have a water system of utility that is 40% underutilized, that we can deal with issues related to the fact that we have over 40 billion gallons of untreated water that overflow into the CSO on an annual basis. So it's really imperative that we think about landscape as infrastructure, and this is the absolute time to move from 21st century systems of monofunctional, single-use, divided community and top-down decisions about infrastructure, and realize that landscape can move us towards infrastructure that is multifunctional for multiple users, builds community assets rather than divide and displace communities, and can be inclusive in its approach to decision making. So through a very exhaustive analysis of systems, topography, migration, and other spatial and ecological factors, we really have looked quite comprehensively at what the network of connecting various aspects and tactics of blue-green infrastructure, from carbon forests to industrial buffers to distributed ponds to surface lakes and filtration parks, that help to move the city from an open space map that is simply a recording of the city's parks and recreation centers, but to a new network of multifunctional, diverse, integrated sets of systems that form this new green palette for the city. And in doing so, what we hope to do is promote healthier lifestyles, increase access to healthy food, capture and clean stormwater, clean soil, improve air quality, stabilize communities, reduce maintenance costs, create jobs, and above all, promote new kinds of social and cultural life for the city. Thank you.